G'day gorgeous people and welcome back to Politics Made OK. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and follow me as I try my absolute bestest to make everything in federal politics bearable. Yep, it's a big task right now, but I'm taking it on. One bad pun and mini breakdown at a time. So because it's October and that means Halloween's around the corner, I thought I'd lean in and make this episode scary. And what scares the government more than anything else? Well, if your name's Peter Dutton, probably the sun. Or, you know, Harry Potter. But more broadly, the thing that seems to fill them with fear and knee-wobbling terror is this spectre that haunts them. I'm talking about the thing that paralyses them into doing next to nothing. And that is, of course, meaningful action on climate change. Yep, terrifying. But is the government actually starting to face this fear of taking meaningful action and taking on the Nationals in the party room? Let's have a chat about it on this week's show of PMO. Now, it doesn't take too close a watcher of politics to know our country could be doing a bit better when it comes to climate change. Yeah, we're like that kid with bad grades. But instead of upping those grades, we just point to other kids doing worse. Even though those kids are poorer and worse off and supporting, oh, I don't know, 1 billion people.
We cannot ignore the fact that the developing world accounts for 2/3 of global emissions, and those emissions are rising.
That was what Morrison said just a couple of months ago in response to this massive UN report on climate change that found global warming would hit 1.5 degrees in about a decade if we didn't do something about it. And yet, the first thing the Prime Minister of our country said was, well, not my fault. Even though developed countries like ours have advanced our economies on the basis of fossil fuel industries for a really long time. Yeah, just good stuff. It's just this argument that the coalition's been making for a long time, that because we're not one of the major polluters and actually contribute just 1.3% of global emissions, that we just don't have to do as much. Which is dumb, because if all countries that produce less than 2% of global emissions thought that way, well, we'd be stuffed. I mean, sure, we're not one of the big polluters, but could we ever be in a position to put pressure on those big polluters or help them improve and not, I don't know, set the world on fire? If we have such an embarrassing track record? How does that Bible verse go? You know, the one telling thou not to try remove the splinter from the eye of your brother before removing the coal-shaped lump from your own. Yep, I went to Sunday school. Now, the big thing that's been making headlines for a while now is that Australia hasn't committed to achieving net zero by 2050. It's weird, because like all states and territories and heaps of businesses have done so. But the federal government just hasn't. They're kind of just like, nah, can't hear you, nah. The question is, what are they so scared of? You'd think melting ice caps, releasing ancient viruses into the world, and unprecedented wildfires that literally turn the sky red would be the ultimate nightmare. But no, the thing they seem to be most scared of is, well, the Nationals. You know, the other party that makes up our coalition. The Nationals have said for ages that they don't want these commitments or too much action on climate change because it means the farmers and miners who they represent in regional Australia will lose out. The funny thing is, a lot of the peak bodies for these sectors have already made targets of their own, including the Minerals Council of Australia and the National Farmers Federation. But Nationals like Matt Canavan have made it pretty clear that they'll never agree to net zero by 2050 because it's going to cost regional jobs. Yeah, that's the guy who made that snarky tweet wondering whether the Taliban will commit to net zero. Which was meant to be a comment on how we're all too focused on first world problems. And that's coming from someone in a government that loves to point out that the current rise in emissions is really the fault of the developing world. Anyway, Canavan himself is not what scares the government, though the man is like really tall. It always shocks me when I see him in the halls of Parliament. He's like a reverse Tom Cruise. What the government is scared of is the fact that it really only is the government because it's a coalition of 2 parties. And it needs to have that Nationals party on board. Not doing so means the Nationals could vote against the government on its climate policy or other bills and policy just because they're mad. Or do something like leave the coalition altogether and run as an independent. So, it's pretty clear. Losing power is the fear. Not a world on fire, but just the numbers. Despite all of this, things are actually starting to change. And by things, I mean just language. So don't get too excited. But the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, made this huge speech a few weeks ago, which was a real departure from the government's normal line. In that speech, he said things like Australia risks being left behind by the rest of the world. And that, like, foreign investors won't give us or our businesses money if they see we're not doing enough on climate change. Hold on, what? Are we actually going to start upping those grades? And not just point to the people who are doing bad? Incredible. And then a couple of weeks later, the PM also sort of shifted the language a bit.
We will remain competitive over the next generation and more. I mean, the world is changing. And we've got to ensure that we put Australia in the strongest possible position to keep our jobs, to keep our industries, and to ensure our regions in particular are able to be brought through what is a global change that's occurring.
Yeah, like bringing in rhetoric about not being left behind and keeping up with the changes of the world. Now, there's a lot of rumblings in Parliament and the press gallery that the government's about to hand down a plan to get to net zero by 2050. Or at the very least, like the modelling of what it would cost the economy and how it would impact different sectors. I mean, this is wild, considering the comments the PM made just like 2 months ago following that UN report. Wait, am I saying the government's speedy when it's coming to its climate policy? Nah, that can't be right. So follow this channel now as I keep tracking this issue and keeping you up to date with what's actually going on. And tell me what you actually think about this whole net zero by 2050 thing. Are you worried about it? Do you think it doesn't matter? Did you want it to happen sooner? I'd love to hear from you, so comment below and I'll be seeing you next time on Politics Made OK.